What if love itself could become a mirror for your deepest wounds? What if the person who entered your life to awaken you came disguised as the very thing that once broke you? Carl Jung often reminded us that every encounter between two souls is not accidental. It's an alchemical meeting between light and shadow. The empath and the narcissist are not simply opposites. They are magnetic forces orbiting the same wound, one seeking to give everything, the other seeking to take it all. Their meeting is not a coincidence, it's a psychological initiation. At first, the empath sees beauty in the narcissist's confidence, a sense of power that feels both foreign and familiar. The narcissist, in turn, is drawn to the empath's purity, their emotional warmth that seems to fill an invisible void. But what appears as a connection is actually a reflection. The empath's innocence mirrors the narcissist's emptiness, while the narcissist's charm mirrors the empath's longing to be seen. Together, they form a symbolic polarity, a living illustration of Jung's principle that what we deny in ourselves will find us in another. This is where the illusion begins. The empath mistakes intensity for intimacy. The narcissist mistakes attention for love. One gives endlessly, believing that love can heal the other's void. The other takes compulsively, believing that being adored will soothe their own. But in truth, both are acting out a story written long before they met, a reenactment of childhood patterns, unhealed archetypes, and unconscious desires to complete what was once broken. When light meets shadow, the purpose is not destruction but revelation. The empath's compassion exposes the narcissist's mask, while the narcissist's manipulation reveals the empath's unresolved wounds. Through this painful dance, each is invited to see what has long been buried within. The relationship becomes both mirror and crucible, burning away illusions, forcing transformation, and leading the empath toward individuation. Ultimately, this connection was never just about love. It was about awakening. And sometimes the soul sends us its greatest teachers in the form of those who wound us the most. Have you ever felt the moment someone's smile no longer fools you, but frightens you? When their charm feels empty, their praise turns hollow, and suddenly you see what was always hidden in plain sight. That moment is not just realization, it is awakening. And for the empath, it marks the beginning of a profound inner shift. It usually doesn't come during an argument or a loud betrayal. It arrives in the silence. A strange stillness enters the body when you no longer rush to fix the mood, explain your feelings, or shrink yourself to keep the peace. Something within begins to see the narcissist not as they appear, but as they truly are. A wounded child in a mask, defending themselves with control. It is an eerie clarity, like waking up in the middle of a dream and realizing you are inside someone else's illusion. That is when the empath begins to see, not just with their eyes, but with their energy, their nervous system, their dreams. Carl Jung calls this a moment of lucidity inside the unconscious. It's when we begin to relate to another not from projection, but from awareness. Yet this insight carries a risk. The empath, so skilled in emotional language, may now unconsciously slip into the very shadow they have just decoded. They begin to intellectualize the pain, analyze the narcissist's trauma, and even excuse the harm. Jung warned that understanding the shadow is only the beginning. The true danger is in becoming enchanted by it. In real life, this looks like a woman who stays after the first betrayal, saying, "I understand where his pain comes from." It looks like a man who tolerates emotional withdrawal because he senses the fear behind it. It looks like empathy is turning into entrapment. Because to truly understand the narcissist is to feel the ghost of their wounds whisper to your own. And that is where the battle begins. If you are not anchored in your own truth, the shadow will not just speak to you, it will seduce you. This is why many empaths become exhausted at this stage. They know too much, feel too deeply, and yet cannot seem to leave. It is no longer confusion that holds them, but complexity. They are now awake within the story, but unsure how to exit it without guilt or self-betrayal. The narcissist, sensing this shift, may grow more charming or more cruel, either to pull them back into the old dance. The empath walks a razor's edge, tempted to play rescuer, tempted to stay wise yet small, tempted to use their understanding as a reason to remain. But this is where healing must begin. The empath must turn their insight inward. Instead of interpreting the narcissist's silence, they must listen to their own. Instead of decoding the other's moods, they must ask, "Why do I feel responsible for someone else's brokenness?" The answer is never about the narcissist. It is about the old belief buried in the empath's psyche, that love must be earned through suffering, that peace must be paid for with silence. The waking up, then, is not about becoming smarter. It is about becoming sovereign. It is the beginning of true individuation. The empath starts to realize, I can understand your wounds without abandoning mine. I can feel your pain without absorbing it. I can see your shadow without forgetting my light. And that shift, subtle, sacred, and deeply internal, is where the empath begins to rise, not in rage, but in remembrance, not in vengeance, but in vision. Because to wake up inside an illusion is terrifying, but to choose not to go back to sleep, that is power. What if the person you were trying so hard to love was only reflecting the part of yourself you've always feared was unlovable? This is the moment the empath begins to shift their gaze inward. After the emotional storm settles and the masks fall away, what remains is not just disillusionment with the narcissist, it is a confrontation with the self. The empath starts to question the origin of their overgiving. Why did they tolerate the emotional starvation? Why did they silence their needs and offer unconditional compassion to someone who rarely returned it? At first, the answer seems obvious. They were trying to help. But beneath the surface, something far more ancient begins to stir. Carl Jung teaches us that the shadow is not just darkness, it is the denied light of the soul. And often, that denied light is hidden in the belief that love must be earned through pain. The empath, upon deeper reflection, sees that their relentless compassion was not pure altruism. It was a defense mechanism, a psychic strategy developed in childhood to survive emotional abandonment or conditional love. Perhaps they grew up with a parent whose affection depended on performance, obedience, or emotional caretaking. Perhaps they were taught, quietly and repeatedly, that their worth was tied to their ability to soothe others, to never cause waves, to be easy to love. So when the narcissist entered their life, this old story was reactivated, not by chance, but by resonance. Jung called this the complex, a knot in the unconscious, vibrating with unresolved emotion, seeking reenactment. The narcissist mirrored the original source of pain, but in adult form. They triggered the empath's hidden wound. If I am not useful, I will be abandoned. That is why the empath stayed. Not because they were weak, but because they were trying to rewrite their own forgotten script. But then something extraordinary happens. The empath begins to dream differently. They may see broken staircases, mirrors cracking, or fog lifting in their inner world. These are not random images. They are symbolic messages from the unconscious, revealing that the true battle was never external. It was within. The narcissist, once seen as a villain, now appears as a dark teacher, one who awakened the buried archetypes the empath needed to face. Not to be destroyed, but to be healed. This is the turning point where the empath's identity shifts. They stop seeing themselves as a giver who must bleed to feel valuable. Instead, they reclaim the right to receive without guilt. They begin setting boundaries not to punish others, but to honor their own soul. The narcissist fades from the center of the narrative. The story now becomes one of self-initiation, one of decoding personal mythology, of naming old wounds not with shame, but with clarity. Because healing is not forgetting what happened. It is remembering who you were before the wound was handed to you. And so, the empath steps into a new chapter, not to seek revenge or to fix the other, but to integrate the fragments of the self that were once scattered across people, performances, and projections. This is what Jung called individuation, a sacred return to wholeness. And in this journey, the narcissist becomes what they were always meant to be. Not your destiny, but your mirror. A reflection that forced you to see the part of yourself you are finally ready to love. What happens when you stop needing to explain yourself to the very person who once thrived on your confusion? There comes a quiet shift in the empath's journey that feels less like a decision and more like a homecoming. After years of trying to be understood, after endless cycles of emotional labor and self-doubt, something within them changes, not as a reaction to pain, but as a return to self. They no longer feel the compulsion to justify, to fix, or to beg for clarity. The silence that once felt like a punishment becomes a sanctuary. And in that stillness, a new kind of power emerges. This is not the silence of suppression. It is the silence of alignment. The empath has now learned the narcissist's language, not to mimic their control, but to read between their lines. They can sense the emotional bait, the subtle guilt, the veiled threats, and they no longer bite. There is no longer a need to defend innocence or prove good intentions. The mirror no longer distorts because the empath no longer seeks reflection there. Jung calls this the individuation of response, the ability to act from inner wholeness, not unconscious reflex. In real life, this shift is often misunderstood. People might say, "You've changed," or "You're being cold," when in fact, the empath is simply centered. Take the woman who once stayed up nights deciphering text messages from a partner who alternated between charm and cruelty. Now, she lets the phone ring and walks away. Or the man who spent years tolerating subtle emotional sabotage from a friend, always afraid to draw boundaries. Now, he smiles calmly and ends the conversation early. There is no scene, no explosion, just a quiet refusal to engage in the same spiritual rehearsal. But here lies the danger. When the empath gains this power, there may be a temptation to use it against the very person who once used it on them. The urge to control, to withdraw affection as punishment, to become the mirror that wounds, it can be seductive. Jung warns us that the moment we integrate the shadow, we risk becoming it. And so the empath must walk a higher path, one where silence is not a weapon, but a boundary that reflects clarity, not control. This new presence is magnetic, not performative, not dramatic, just real. The empath radiates a calm that unsettles those who once fed off their confusion. They no longer need to prove their worth or retaliate against harm. They have tasted their own wholeness, and it is enough. The narcissist may rage louder. They may try to provoke, to shame, to resurrect the old script. But the empath no longer auditions. They have already reclaimed the role of their own life. Silence, in this sense, is not the absence of voice. It is the presence of the soul. And when the empath speaks again, it is no longer from the wound. It is from wisdom. It is from a place so grounded that even manipulation has no place to land. That is when the narcissist loses their grip, not because they were overpowered, but because there is nothing left to hook. No reaction, no validation, no echo, only stillness. And in that stillness, the empath does not become like the narcissist. They become themselves, fully, quietly, unapologetically. What happens to someone who once fed on your emotional chaos when you finally stop offering the meal? At first, it feels quiet, too quiet, like the silence that follows a storm which once defined your entire world. But the empath, now attuned to their own emotional compass, realizes something extraordinary. The absence of drama is not a void. It is a space where clarity can breathe. Where once every message, look, or gesture from the narcissist triggered waves of guilt, confusion, or panic, now there is stillness. Not apathy, but sovereignty. The empath has broken the psychic contract that once bound their identity to emotional performance. Carl Jung teaches that true transformation occurs not by destroying the other, but by withdrawing the projection that gave them power. The narcissist was never the source. They were the screen, and now that screen flickers. The empath no longer leaks energy into a performance. They no longer chase closure or beg for emotional reciprocity. In that withdrawal, the narcissist does not encounter punishment. They encounter absence. And to the narcissist, absence is intolerable. For years, the narcissist thrived in the role of puppeteer, tugging strings of validation, shame, affection, and rejection. But now, the strings have been cut. There is no one left to manipulate, no confusion to amplify, no mirror reflecting their fantasy. The empath sees this not as a victory, but as a release, not as revenge, but as rebirth. They are no longer interested in winning. They are interested in walking. And the universe speaks to them in symbols. Dreams shift from claustrophobic staircases and locked rooms to open skies, distant mountains, and ships unmoored. A woman who once dreamt of drowning now dreams of flying. A man who used to see himself trapped in mirrors now sees himself walking through forests alone, but at peace. These are not just dreams. They are psychic confirmations that the inner work is real. The unconscious is beginning to reorient itself. The soul is returning home. The narcissist, feeling the absence, often returns for one last performance. They may offer an apology that feels hollow. They may trigger an old memory, hoping to reignite a reaction. They might even promise change, sensing their hold is slipping. But the empath no longer needs proof. They see the dance and choose not to join, not with anger, not with superiority, but with quiet certainty that their path no longer requires this dynamic. In everyday life, this looks like unsubscribing from old conversations. It seems that spending time with people who bring calmness instead of adrenaline. It looks like silence after a message that once would have consumed hours of overthinking. It looks like joy showing up unexpectedly on an afternoon walk, or the surprising pleasure of choosing not to explain your inner world to someone who never truly listened. Jung reminds us that what we withdraw from loses its life force in our psyche. The narcissist fades, not because they were defeated, but because the empath no longer orbits their gravity. The drama dissolves because the projection is retrieved. The bond breaks because the mirror is turned inward. And in this new mirror, the empath sees someone they hadn't met in a long time, themselves. Not the person shaped by reaction, not the one molded by emotional survival, but the one who chooses consciously, who feels clearly, who loves freely, but not blindly. This is the shift that changes everything. It is not loud, it is not dramatic. It is the quietest revolution, the one that begins when you decide to live in truth, not performance. So, ask yourself, what does your life become when you are no longer emotionally available to chaos? And are you brave enough to find out? What if the love you were begging for was never yours to chase, but yours to remember? There comes a sacred moment when the empath, once entangled in the thorns of emotional bargaining, finally sees through the illusion, not with bitterness, not with anger, but with a clarity so profound it feels like waking up from a long spiritual sleep. The narcissist may return, cloaked in new promises, voicing regret, or weaving nostalgic strings tied to the past. But the spell has broken. The projection has crumbled. The soul no longer confuses intensity with intimacy, nor pain with purpose. In this moment, the empath stands at the edge of true individuation. Carl Jung described individuation as the process of becoming whole, not by erasing the past, but by integrating it. And here, the empath is no longer the compulsive healer trying to fix what refuses to be held. They are no longer a child disguised in adult responsibility, chasing love through self-abandonment. They are no longer performing goodness to earn crumbs of care. Instead, they become something radical in a world built on codependence, a sovereign presence. Sovereignty does not roar. It does not retaliate. It simply no longer chases. This transformation is not about rejecting the narcissist in revenge. It is about no longer needing the role they once played in your psyche. You see the mask now. You hear the manipulation without needing to respond. And more than anything, you recognize the deeper truth. The narcissist was never truly your source of love. They were a mirror for the part of you that hadn't yet realized you were already whole. In real life, this shows up in beautifully quiet ways. You sit at a dinner table surrounded by people who don't require you to shrink. You enjoy a walk where your mind is not scanning for emotional danger. You hear your phone buzz and feel no dread. You begin projects without second-guessing your worth. You feel a deeper trust in your own decisions without needing someone else's permission. And maybe most striking of all, you can finally look in the mirror and say, I am no longer the child trying to be good enough to be chosen. This is not closure, it is return. A return to your own inner child, the one who once believed love had to be earned through sacrifice, the one who carried guilt for others' emotions, the one who thought peace was dangerous because it never lasted. That child who wore emotional armor for decades is finally met with a new guardian, your present-day self, one who listens, one who protects, one who no longer negotiates their soul to feel safe. Jung taught that healing happens when the conscious mind turns inward toward the forgotten, fragmented parts of the psyche. The narcissist, once seen as the enemy, is now revealed as a psychic messenger, sent not to destroy you, but to awaken you. And when their role is complete, they are released, not as villains, but as symbols. And this is the final break of the spell, when you no longer resist the past nor recreate it. You witness the story, you learn from it, and then you choose a new one. A story where love is no longer earned through pain. A story where your presence is no longer a performance. A story where the mirror no longer distorts, but reflects truth. So ask yourself, what becomes possible when you no longer carry the wound that once made you chase people who could never love you properly? And when you stop trying to save them, do you realize you've already saved yourself? What if the greatest love story was not between you and another, but between you and the self you once abandoned? The final stage is not loud. It does not announce itself with grand gestures or dramatic exits. Instead, it hums in the quiet choices, the way you no longer rush to explain yourself, the way you sit with discomfort instead of fleeing into old distractions, the way you walk into a room and no longer scan for who needs saving. It is subtle, but sacred. It is the moment the empath no longer translates the world through pain, but through presence. Carl Jung taught that wholeness is not about becoming flawless. It is about integrating all that was once disowned, the shadow, the fear, the longing, the rage, and holding it in the compassionate gaze of awareness. The empath, once fragmented by survival roles, now becomes whole by no longer rejecting their depth. Their intuition is no longer a curse that makes them overly responsible. It becomes a compass that guides them toward people, places, and paths aligned with their soul's truth. Where there was once exhaustion, now there is discernment. Where there was once people-pleasing, now there is peace. The empath does not need to become hard to be safe. They remain soft but rooted, open but not porous, loving but not lost. This is the quiet revolution. Relationships take on new meaning, no longer forged from lack. They are formed through resonance. The empath meets others not to rescue them, but to witness their unfolding. There is no urge to fix, no compulsion to prove worth through sacrifice. Instead, there is a deeper stillness, a sacred neutrality. Love becomes a space of mutual recognition rather than emotional labor. And in this space, intimacy becomes possible for the first time. Not the enmeshment of old patterns, but the shared presence of two whole beings. Even the narcissist, once the central storm in the empath's life, now becomes a meaningful chapter instead of the entire book. Their role is no longer cursed, but understood. They were the teacher who unknowingly showed empathy where their boundaries were missing, where their inner child still bled, where the false self was masquerading as love. And now the empath closes that chapter, not in hatred, but in reverence for the awakening it stirred. The real miracle is not that the empath healed. It is that they chose to keep their heart open even as they reclaimed their voice. To speak the language of the soul is to stop performing. It is to speak not to convince, but to connect. It is to express without attachment, to walk away without bitterness, to stay without fear. This is what it means to write your life from the center of the self. You are no longer the supporting character in someone else's drama. You are the author, the storyteller, the presence at the center of your own becoming. And so, the journey ends where it truly begins, with the self. Not the mask, not the projection, but the luminous, quiet, sovereign self that was waiting all along beneath the noise, beneath the roles, beneath the trauma. You are not who you were before the pain. You are not who you were during it. You are the one who rose from it with eyes open and heart intact, and now you are free. If this touched something sacred inside you, don't let it fade into silence. Like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Your presence here is not just support, it's resonance. And if you feel moved to give back, your donation becomes a quiet but powerful gesture that helps keep this light alive for others still walking in the dark.